Congresswoman, yes or no? Did your campaign pay your husband's company $2.9 million? It was about as simple as a question gets. Just 6 words that mattered, yes or no, and about 20 more for context. The kind of question a first-year law student could handle. It was a question that should have taken all of 1 second to answer. But Ilhan Omar didn't answer it in 1 second. She didn't answer it in 10 seconds either. Instead, she launched into a sentence about politically motivated attacks rooted in Islamophobia and xenophobia. And that's when Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who'd been leaning back in his chair with the sleepy patience of a man watching a fish toy with a baited hook, suddenly sat forward, adjusted his reading glasses, and said with a drawl so slow you could time it with a sundial, "Ma'am, I didn't ask you about your feelings. I asked you about your checkbook." And there he sat. And that right there was the moment, though it wasn't the worst moment. Not by a long shot, because it was just then becoming clear that Ilhan Omar had made a catastrophic miscalculation. You see, she had walked into that Senate hearing room convinced she was the smartest person there. She wasn't. In fact, she wasn't even the second smartest person in the room. The second smartest was likely Kennedy's aide, a quiet woman by the name of Catherine, who'd spent 3 weeks putting together the folder that now sat in front of the senator like a loaded gun he hadn't even bothered to touch yet. This senator from Louisiana had been in the game a lot longer than Omar had been in Congress, and he came to this hearing armed with something far more dangerous than simple outrage. He had come with cold, hard math. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. To really get just how badly things fell apart for the Congresswoman from Minnesota's 5th District, we have to rewind about 90 minutes to the moment she walked into room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building carrying a prepared statement, flanked by her comms team, and filled with the absolute certainty that she was about to be persecuted. And she was half right. She was, in fact, about to be questioned. But in Washington, there's a world of difference between the two. And it all comes down to whether or not you have good answers. The hearing's official title was written in that uniquely dry language of the United States Senate: Oversight of Federal Fund Integrity and Congressional Financial Disclosure. If you saw that title pop up on C-SPAN, you'd flip the channel immediately. If you saw it on a piece of paper, you might just use it to clean your glasses. This was, by design, the kind of hearing nobody ever watches, which, of course, is exactly the kind of hearing where the real damage happens, because no one is playing for the cameras, and everyone is playing for the record. The Senate Judiciary Committee had called in 3 witnesses for the day. 2 of them were just bureaucrats from the Office of Congressional Ethics and the Federal Election Commission, there to provide some context, data, and the legal background. The 3rd witness, however, was Representative Ilhan Omar, who'd been invited to testify about some questions regarding her financial disclosures that had been swirling around in the press for months. Now she could have declined the invitation. In fact, her own lawyers told her to decline. But she didn't decline, because Ilhan Omar has never met a microphone she didn't think she could charm, and because turning it down would have looked like she was hiding, and that was the one look she couldn't afford. So she arrived at 9:40 with an entourage of 4, her chief of staff, a communications director, a legislative aide, and a young man whose only job seemed to be carrying the leather briefcase with her prepared statement inside. She was dressed perfectly. Her hijab was a deep navy blue that perfectly matched the room's wood paneling, a detail that was either a happy coincidence or the work of a very talented stylist. She shook hands with the chairman of the committee. She offered a smile to the press row. She had the look of a woman who had done this 100 times before, because she had, and who fully expected to do it 100 more times again. Senator Kennedy, on the other hand, showed up 7 minutes late, carrying a styrofoam coffee cup that looked like he'd picked it up at a gas station somewhere between Baton Rouge and the Beltway. His tie was just a little crooked. His hair looked like it had met a comb recently, but that they weren't in a committed relationship. He gave a nod to his colleagues, sat down with a thud, and spent the first few minutes of the hearing just reading a single sheet of paper, all while the committee chair delivered opening remarks that nobody, not even the chair himself, seemed to find interesting. He had the appearance of a man who'd just wandered into the wrong room by mistake. But he hadn't. Omar's opening statement, for its part, was a masterclass in political craftsmanship. For 6 minutes, she spoke about the targeting of Muslim women in public life, the weaponization of congressional oversight for political hits, her own commitment to transparency, and her record of serving the people of Minnesota. She brought up the death threats she'd received, she mentioned Donald Trump, and she dropped the word Islamophobia 4 separate times, which was the perfect number to frame the narrative without overdoing it. She finished with a line that sounded like it was written for the evening news. "I have always been transparent with the American people, and I welcome any good faith inquiry into my record." It was delivered perfectly. It was obviously rehearsed. It was the exact kind of statement that works great when the person asking the questions is actually looking for a debate. But Senator Kennedy wasn't interested in a debate. He was interested in asking questions that had real answers. And then seeing if those answers matched the numbers in his folder. While Omar was talking, Kennedy never looked up. He just wrote something down on his legal pad. A camera operator, bored with all the opening statements, zoomed in. Kennedy had written a number, $2,900,000. He underlined it twice. Omar's aide saw it on the monitor. She leaned over and whispered something in the Congresswoman's ear. Omar's rhythm broke for just a split second, the kind of break only someone paying very close attention would ever notice. She recovered, finishing her statement with a small, confident nod. Kennedy finished his coffee. One of them was ready. The first 30 minutes went to the committee chair and the ranking member, who asked the FEC and ethics officials a series of procedural questions, mostly just to establish that, yes, members of Congress do have to file financial disclosures, and yes, those disclosures are supposed to be accurate, and yes, you can get hit with penalties for filing fake ones. It was the legislative version of a band tuning their instruments before a concert. Necessary, but not what anybody actually came to hear. Then it was Kennedy's turn. He kicked things off the way he always did, with a courtesy so thick you could spread it on toast. "Congresswoman Omar, thank you for being here today. I know your time is valuable, and I know this isn't anybody's idea of a good Tuesday morning. So I appreciate your willingness to sit down with us." Omar nodded graciously. "Thank you, Senator. I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd appreciate short answers if you can manage them, because I've only got a few minutes, and I talk slower than most folks, so I'm already behind." A little bit of laughter went through the room. Even Omar smiled. Kennedy smiled back. To anyone who didn't know his technique, it was a perfectly pleasant chat between two colleagues. To anyone who did know his technique, it was the sound of a trap being set. "Congresswoman, you file an annual financial disclosure with the House. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And you review that disclosure before you sign it?" "Yes, I do." "And you're aware that knowingly filing a false disclosure is a federal offense?" "Of course, and your most recent disclosure was filed in 2024, covering the calendar year." "Is that right?" "That's correct." "Thank you." Kennedy looked down at his folder, flipped a page, and took his time. "Congresswoman, do you know what your husband does for a living?" My husband is a businessman and an investor. Do you know the current estimated value of his companies? Omar paused. I would have to refer to the specific disclosure for the exact figures. I've done that for you, so let me save you the trouble. In your 2023 disclosure, are your husband's combined business interests, a winery in California and a venture capital firm in Washington, were valued at approximately $51,000. In your 2024 disclosure, those same interests were valued at approximately $30 million. He just let that number hang in the air, kind of like a skunk in a closet. It wasn't going anywhere, and sooner or later, everyone was going to smell it. That is a 3,500% increase in 1 year. He took off his glasses, cleaned them with his tie, and put them back on. The whole thing took about 8 seconds, and every single one of those seconds was a masterclass in theatrical timing that Kennedy would, of course, later deny was theatrical at all. Now, Congresswoman, I'm not a sophisticated man. Down in Louisiana, I'm just a country lawyer who got lucky. But where I come from, when a man's catfish farm goes from 51,000 to 30 million overnight, we don't call that a good year. We call the sheriff. The hearing room just broke. Not with applause. Senate hearing rooms don't do applause, but with that kind of choked-back laughter that comes out as coughs and cleared throats and people suddenly fascinated by their water glasses. 2 reporters in the press row had to cover their mouths. The FEC official at the witness table just stared up at the ceiling. Even the committee chair, who was supposed to be keeping order, and was pressing his lips together so tight it looked like he was fighting a losing battle. Omar didn't laugh. Her communications director, sitting in the row right behind her, didn't laugh. The young guy with the briefcase just stared down at his shoes. Senator, my husband's business ventures are his own, Omar said, with the kind of controlled precision of a surgeon picking out their tools. I report what is required by law, and I have done so faithfully. Yes, ma'am. And what you reported is that your household went from 51,000 to 30 million in 12 months. And I'm not questioning if you reported it. I'm questioning how it happened. Because that winery your husband co-owns is currently being sued by an investor who claims he was defrauded. And that venture capital firm is being sued by 3 cannabis companies in South Dakota, who say they're owed between $1.2 and $2 million. He leaned forward. So, your husband promised to triple an investor's money in the wine business. He took the money. He didn't triple it. He got sued. Then he started a cannabis venture. He took more money. He didn't deliver. He got sued again. Kennedy paused. When he spoke again, his voice had the gentle, almost sympathetic quality of a man giving a eulogy for someone who had it coming. Congresswoman, I'm not a smart man, and before you agree with that, let me finish. But where I come from, doing the same thing twice and getting sued both times isn't bad luck. It's a business model. Omar's aide was writing furiously on a notepad and sliding it across the table. Omar glanced at it, then back at Kennedy. Senator, these are matters involving my husband's private business dealings. I have no involvement. No involvement. Okay, let's talk about the involvement you did have. Let's talk about your campaign. Kennedy opened the folder. He did it slowly. See, like a man opening a toolbox who knows exactly which tool he needs and is in no rush to find it. Congresswoman, between July of 2019 and November of 2020, your campaign committee made roughly 140 payments to the E Street Group. That's a political consulting firm co-owned by your husband, Tim Minette. The total amount of those payments was $2,780,000. Some records put it closer to $2.9 million. Let's split the difference and call it a lot of money. Omar shifted in her seat. The E Street Group provided comprehensive campaign services, including digital advertising, fundraising, consulting, and mail production. Yes, ma'am, I've read the filings. Digital ads, fundraising, mail, the whole menu. Now, here's what's interesting to me. After the 2020 election, you publicly cut ties with your husband's firm. You told your donors you were doing it to remove any perceived issue. Those were your words, correct. And I stand by that decision. I'm sure you do. But here's my question. After you stopped paying your husband's firm, you hired a handful of other firms to do the same work. Ads, fundraising, mail, all of it. And the total you paid those firms in the next cycle was roughly $1 million. He let the math hang in the air. So, the same services, the same work, and the same ads on the same platforms for the same campaign, and the price drops from $2.9 million to $1 million. That's a 66% discount. He looked at her over the top of his glasses. Congresswoman, help me understand something. Was your husband 3 times better at this than everyone else in Washington? Or was your campaign 3 times more generous to him than it should have been? The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight, that you could feel it pressing down on the room, like the humidity before a Gulf Coast storm. Omar's chief of staff had stopped writing and was staring at a fixed point on the wall. The young man with the briefcase hadn't moved in about 4 minutes. Omar leaned into the microphone. Senator, these numbers are misleading. The 2020 election was unprecedented. We faced $14 million in opposition spending. The scale of operations was vastly different from a normal cycle. And I didn't ask about the scale. I asked about the price. You paid your husband's firm $2.9 million. You paid other firms $1 million for the same thing. I'm asking you to explain the difference, not the election. The difference? The services were not identical. Your own filing descriptions say they were digital advertising, fundraising, consulting, mail production. Same line items, different price, different vendor. And the old vendor happened to share your bed. The committee chair shifted uncomfortably. A Democrat on the panel looked at his phone. These were not the optics anyone on Omar's side had prepared for. Kennedy wasn't done. He reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. In July of 2020 alone, 1 month, your campaign paid the E Street Group $66,000. That was 77% of everything your campaign spent that month. 77 cents of every dollar your donors gave went to your husband's company. And he set the paper down. Now, I want to talk about one of those donors. I have a message here that was sent to your campaign in September of 2020. I don't know this person. Never met her. Her name is Linda Kowalski. She's a 3rd-grade teacher in Bloomington, Minnesota. She donated $27 to your campaign. He picked up the paper and read from it slowly. She wrote, Representative Omar, I believe in what you're fighting for. I teach 3rd grade, and I don't have much to spare, but I want to contribute what I can. Please use this to make a difference. Kennedy set the paper down and looked at Omar. $27. That's all Miss Linda from Bloomington could spare. And from the way your campaign spent its money that month, it looks like 77 cents of every dollar she gave. About $21 of her 27 went straight to your husband's company. Miss Linda believed she was funding a cause. Instead, she was funding a family business. And the room fell completely silent. It wasn't the tense silence of a political showdown, but something quieter and much more awkward. It was the silence of people adding up numbers in their heads and not liking the answer. When Omar finally spoke, her voice was strained. "Senator, individual donations are pooled together and used for the campaign's general expenses. You can't link one specific donation to one specific payment." "You're right. I can't trace her $27, but I can trace your $2.9 million. And I can trace how, after you stopped paying your husband, the same work suddenly got done for a third of the price. Miss Linda doesn't need to be a forensic accountant to figure out what that means. And neither does anyone else in this room." Omar's communications director grabbed for her phone. Kennedy saw it. "Ma'am, if your team is getting ready to release a statement calling this Islamophobic, I would strongly suggest they rethink that. I haven't said a word about your religion. I haven't said a word about your race. I haven't said a word about your gender. I've talked about $2.9 million. If $2.9 million is somehow Islamophobic, well, that's a new one for me, but I'm always willing to learn." A wave of laughter went through the room, the kind that just bursts out before anyone can stop it. Even one of the Democrats on the committee had to turn his head to hide a smile. Kennedy didn't crack a smile. He didn't have to. The jab had hit its mark, and he just carried on as if he hadn't said anything special, which only made it hit harder. Omar tried what seasoned politicians like to call a reset. It's a calculated pivot to a new topic, usually kicked off by a change in posture, a sip of water, and a sentence that starts with, "Let me be clear." She did all three. "Let me be clear. A senator. I've been hit with politically motivated attacks for years. My finances have been put under a microscope more than any other person in this body. And every single investigation, every review, and every audit has come up with absolutely no wrongdoing. The FEC looked into the E Street Group payments and found 0 legal violations. I cooperated completely, and I was cleared." It was a strong comeback. On any other day, with any other person asking the questions, it probably would have worked. Kennedy just nodded. "You're right. The FEC found no legal violations. I'll give you that. But, Congresswoman, not illegal and not wrong are two different things. Not illegal just means you didn't break a law. Not wrong means you didn't break people's trust. And as I sit here looking at a third-grade teacher's $27, I have to wonder if you even know the difference." Omar didn't answer right away. That Kennedy didn't give her the chance. "Let me ask you about something else. Back in February of this year, you posted something on social media, I think it was on X, replying to a user who claimed you were worth $83 million. You wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Try checking my public financial statements, and you will see I barely have thousands, let alone millions." He held up a printed-out screenshot. 2 days after that, you told Business Insider, and again, I'm quoting, "To unlike some of my colleagues, I am not a millionaire." You called these claims, and I quote, "a coordinated right-wing disinformation campaign." You called it, quote, "categorically false." He put the screenshot down and picked up another piece of paper. "This is your 2024 financial disclosure, which you filed just a few months later. It shows your combined household assets are somewhere between $6 and $30 million. He peered at her over the top of his glasses. "Oh, Congresswoman, did you lie on Twitter? Or did you lie on your financial disclosure form? Because one of those statements isn't true. And your name is on both of them." Behind her, Omar's lawyer, a man who had been calmly taking notes this whole time, just put his pen down. Her aide stopped passing her notes. The communications director's fingers stopped moving on her phone. For about 5 whole seconds, Omar's entire team just froze. He'd like a machine that's been given a command it doesn't know how to process. The disclosure shows my husband's assets, not my personal income, Omar said. As I've explained, I am not personally a millionaire. My husband's business? Ma'am, when you filed your taxes jointly, which you do, his 30 million is your 30 million. That's not just my opinion. That isn't a Republican talking point. That's just called marriage. You could ask any family court judge in this country, and they'd tell you the exact same thing over a plate of scrambled eggs. Omar opened her mouth, and then she closed it. It was a tiny movement, but the cameras caught it, and the internet, which had been glued to this since the catfish line, was not about to forget it. Kennedy's tone changed. The folksy warmth vanished like water draining from a tub, and what was left behind was colder, much more calculated. He wasn't putting on a show anymore. He was prosecuting. Congresswoman, I want to bring up something you said back in March of 2019 at a fundraiser for the Council on American Islamic Relations. Do you remember that event? Omar tensed up, just a little. She knew exactly what was coming. Everyone in that room knew exactly what was coming. I do. In that speech, you brought up the September 11th terrorist attacks. You said, and I'm quoting directly from the transcript, CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Kennedy read the line slowly, emphasizing every word. Some people did something. That's how you describe the single worst terrorist attack in the history of America. An attack that killed nearly 3,000 people. Now, I'm sure you've already heard the backlash, so I won't waste time on it. But I do want to focus on one particular response to your comment, because I believe it's important. He put the transcript down and folded his hands on the table. That same year, in September, a man named Nicholas Harros, Jr. was at the Ground Zero Memorial Ceremony, standing at the podium to read the name of his mother, Frances Harros, who was killed in the attacks. He was wearing a T-shirt, and written on the front were the words, "Some people did something." He looked right into the cameras and said, "Today, I am here to respond to you exactly who did what, to whom." Kennedy let the words hang in the air. The room fell completely silent. Even the sound of reporters scribbling in their notebooks had stopped. That man lost his mother, Congresswoman, and he wore your words on his chest to her own memorial. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because your words wounded him in a way that never truly heals. Omar leaned closer to the microphone. Senator, I've already addressed this issue many times. September 11th was an attack on every American, and that includes Muslim Americans who... I'm not asking you to address it again. I'm asking if you can understand, not as a politician, not with rhetoric, but on a human level, what it feels like when a son, in his grief, uses your own words as a sign of protest at his mother's memorial. Silence. That was a rhetorical question, ma'am. You don't have to answer. I believe your expression just did. See, Omar's face, captured by a C-SPAN camera in that unguarded moment, didn't show defiance. It didn't show anger. It showed something more like dawning recognition. It was the look of someone finally hearing something they'd managed to ignore for years, only to find it carried a weight they were completely unprepared for. And with that, Kennedy moved on. He didn't linger on the moment. Lingering would have felt cruel, and cruelty wasn't his tool. Precision was. Congresswoman, let's talk about Minnesota. the state you represent. More specifically, I want to talk about the federal investigation into what prosecutors are estimating to be over $9 billion in welfare fraud. A large part of it is tied to the Feeding Our Future program, and much of it involves members of the Somali community right there in Minneapolis. Omar sat up straighter. She thought she was on safer ground now. Senator, the Trump administration has used that very investigation as an excuse to target the Somali community in my state. They've flooded the streets of Minneapolis with federal agents. They've caused nothing but confusion and chaos. $9 billion, Congresswoman. And they're using this as a weapon against immigrants. $9 billion, which is consistent with a pattern of... Ma'am! Kennedy's voice was quiet, but it sliced through her sentence like a razor through silk. See, $9 billion in fraud isn't confusion. It isn't chaos. It isn't a talking point. By any standard, it's one of the biggest thefts of American tax dollars in the nation's history. And it happened in your state, in your district, and within the very community you represent. He leaned forward again. My question is very simple. At any time before this blew up into a national scandal, while all of this fraud was taking place, while people were stealing money that was meant to feed children, and did you once raise an alarm? Did you get in touch with the Inspector General? Did you call the FBI? Did you write a letter? Did you make a single phone call? Did you do anything at all? One of Omar's aides slid a note over to her. Omar ignored it. I have always stood with my community. Ma'am, standing with your community and standing between your community and the law are two entirely different things. I'm asking you which one it was you did. Omar gave no answer, and the silence that followed was brief. Maybe 3 seconds, 4 at most. But in a Senate hearing, with all the cameras rolling and the official record being made, 3 seconds of silence can write a whole paragraph on its own. Kennedy leaned back in his chair. He looked tired. But it wasn't the kind of tired you feel when you've run out of energy. It was the weariness of a man who had one last thing to say, and wished he didn't have to be the one to say it. Congresswoman, other allegations have been made about your personal history. Allegations concerning your immigration status, your marriage history, things that happened a long time ago. Some of my own colleagues have chased down those questions. Some have even tried to subpoena records. I'm not going to be doing that today. He paused for a moment. I'm not going to ask you about any of that. It wasn't because I find the questions illegitimate, but rather because I feel the questions I've already asked today are enough. I believe the American people heard what they needed to hear. He closed his folder, and I think they're capable of making up their own minds. It was the most devastating thing Kennedy said all day, and he managed to say it by not saying anything at all. The allegations, the marriage fraud claims, the immigration questions, all the things that had followed Omar since 2016, hung in the air like smoke, summoned without being spoken, present without being proven. He had given them weight by simply refusing to touch them, much like a museum puts a velvet rope around a painting, making you look even harder because you can't get close. Omar sat perfectly still. Her prepared statement, immaculate and unread beyond the opening lines, sat before her like a menu at a restaurant that had already closed for the night. Kennedy gathered his papers. He took one last sip from his styrofoam cup, which had been empty for at least 45 minutes, but he tilted it anyway, as if checking for a final drop of coffee, or perhaps a drop of mercy. I want to thank the Congresswoman for her time, he said. I know this wasn't pleasant. I wish I could say it was pleasant for me, either. He paused. But I'd be lying, and we've had enough of that today. The hearing adjourned at 11:52 a.m., meaning it had lasted just over 2 hours, which meant that the senior senator from Louisiana had methodically dismantled a sitting member of Congress in about the time it takes to watch a movie, though the reviews for this particular performance were significantly more divided than any movies would be. Omar rose from the witness table with the practiced composure of a woman who had learned, through years of public life, how to exit a room without looking like she was fleeing. She gathered her papers. She exchanged a brief word with her lawyer. She did not look at Kennedy. She did not look at the press row. She walked out of room 226 of the Dirksen Senate office building, flanked by her staff. And when a reporter from Politico called out, "Congresswoman, do you have any response to Senator Kennedy's questions?" She didn't break her stride, and her communications director simply said, "We'll have a statement later today." They did not have a statement later that day, or the next. When a statement finally appeared 48 hours later, posted to social media at 11 p.m. on a Thursday, the traditional dumping ground for news you hope no one will read, it was 3 paragraphs of familiar language about targeted harassment, Islamophobia, and the weaponization of oversight. It did not mention the E Street Group. It did not mention the $2.9 million. It did not mention the 66% cost reduction. It did not mention Miss Linda from Bloomington. It did not, in fact, to address any of the specific questions Kennedy had asked, which in itself was a kind of answer. Kennedy, meanwhile, lingered in the hearing room for about 15 minutes after the adjournment. He spoke to a few reporters in the hallway, leaning against the marble wall with his hands in his pockets, his tie still crooked. "Senator, do you think Omar was truthful in her testimony today?" "I think she said a lot of words." "Do you think there should be further investigation?" "I think when a person's net worth goes from $51,000 to $30 million in a year, and there are 2 lawsuits with no explanation, that's generally considered a clue." Any comment on the Congresswoman's opening statement about Islamophobia? "Look, I didn't enjoy that hearing." Well, he paused, and for just a moment, the folksy mask slipped, and something sharper glinted beneath it. "Maybe a little, but I'll tell you what I told my mama when I was 12 years old, and she caught me eating pie before dinner. It's not persecution if you actually did it." A reporter asked if he had a final thought. Kennedy considered this for about 1 second longer than was necessary. "I think the Congresswoman has a very fine future in the motivational speaking business." As for Congress, he pushed himself off the wall and straightened his tie, which did nothing to improve its alignment. "I'd say the jury's still out, but the jury went home about an hour ago." The clip of that hallway exchange, 43 seconds unedited, was posted by 3 different outlets within the hour. By evening, it had been viewed 4 million times. By the following morning, it had spawned a cottage industry of reaction videos, remixes, and the inevitable auto-tuned version. The catfish line became a meme. The phrase, "We call the sheriff," became a T-shirt. The Kennedy's 8-second glasses cleaning moment became a reaction GIF that would, in the coming weeks, be deployed in contexts ranging from congressional debates to fantasy football arguments. But the moment that cut deepest, the one that traveled not through comedy but through something closer to conscience, was the mention of Miss Linda's $27. The hashtag appeared within hours. Hashtag Miss Linda's dollars. A reporter with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune tracked down 3 of Omar's actual small-dollar donors from the 2020 campaign, a janitor, a retired librarian, and a college student, and asked them how they felt about 77 cents of every dollar going straight to the candidate's husband. The janitor replied, "I gave $50, and if I'd known, I would have just given it to the food shelf instead." By the end of the week, that quote had been shared over 100,000 times. Omar's team scrambled to reframe the narrative. They got her booked on a friendly podcast. They quickly arranged an Instagram live session. They also coordinated with friendly commentators who painted Kennedy's questioning as just a racist dog whistle wrapped up in Southern charm. The progressive media ecosystem kicked into gear with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, churning out takes, counter-takes, and meta-takes all about the hearing's real meaning. But none of it actually addressed the math, and the math was the one thing people remembered. The political consequences arrived quietly, just like they always do, not as some single catastrophic event, but more like a slow withdrawal of oxygen from the room. In the 2 weeks right after the hearing, two things happened that almost certainly wouldn't have happened before. First, the House Oversight Committee, which had been circling Omar's financial disclosures for months without taking any real action, finally announced an official inquiry. The announcement was, at least on paper, bipartisan. Both the chair and the ranking member signed the letter, which meant the Democrats had done the cold calculation and decided that the political cost of protecting Omar was now higher than the cost of investigating her. In Washington, there's simply no colder algebra than that. And second, three major donors to political action committees aligned with Omar quietly started redirecting their contributions. There were no public statements, no dramatic gestures, just the silent migration of money away from a brand that had suddenly become a liability overnight. One of those donors, when a reporter managed to reach him, said only, "I support accountability in government, and that includes the people I've supported." It was the kind of sentence that ends careers, not with a bang, but with a quiet, tax-deductible whimper. Within the squad. The response, or lack thereof, was telling. Omar's closest ally in Congress, a woman who'd stood beside her at 100 press conferences, defended her through half a dozen other controversies, and had called her sister in public and actually meant it, appeared on a cable news panel just 5 days after the hearing. When the host asked her about Kennedy's questioning, she paused, looked down at the table and said, "See, I believe every member of Congress should welcome transparency and accountability." Then she immediately changed the subject to health care funding. There's a certain frequency that political loyalty operates on, and it sounds exactly like that sentence. Technically supportive, functionally distant, and completely devastating to the person it's supposedly defending. A narrator might note that in Washington, changing the subject is the quietest form of betrayal, and the most permanent. But the deepest wound, the one that hadn't even fully opened on the day of the hearing, was about to come from a totally unexpected direction. 3 weeks after Kennedy's questions echoed through that hearing room, a woman named Rachel Barnett, a former director at the East Street Group, who'd gone on to start her own consulting firm shortly after Omar severed ties with her husband's company, reached out to a reporter at a major national news outlet. Barnett, who was named in campaign finance filings but had never once spoken publicly about her time at the firm, said she was ready to give a detailed account of exactly how campaign funds were allocated, what services were truly rendered, and whether the invoices sent to the Omar campaign reflected the work that was actually done. Now, she hadn't testified yet. She hadn't produced any documents. She had simply indicated that she was willing to talk. And in Washington, the willingness to talk is often more destructive than the talking itself, because it turns every single day that follows into a countdown, and the person being counted down doesn't even know what number they're counting to. The reporter's outlet hadn't published the story yet. They were, in the language of journalism, working on the story. In the language of politics, that same phrase means an obituary is being written while the patient is still alive. Don Samuels, Omar's perennial primary challenger, a man she had publicly dismissed as a tool of corporate interests and privately written off as irrelevant, held a press conference in Minneapolis the very next day. He didn't attack Omar directly. He didn't need to. He just read Kennedy's questions out loud, one by one, and after each one, he simply said, "I would have answered that." He then announced that for the first time since he'd entered the race, his own internal polling showed him within striking distance. The entire press conference lasted just 9 minutes. Omar's office didn't respond to any requests for comment. They were too busy not responding to everything else. The Minnesota Star-Tribune's editorial board, which had always endorsed Omar in previous elections, published an article titled, "Questions That Deserve Answers." It wasn't an endorsement of her opponent. It was something much worse, and it was a withdrawal of their assumed support. The editorial didn't accuse Omar of anything. It simply laid out the questions Kennedy had asked, pointed out that none had been answered, and ended with a sentence that editorial boards use when they want to sound reasonable while setting a building on fire. The people of the 5th District are entitled to clarity. So far, they have not received it. Omar's fundraising emails, which had always generated 6-figure surges whenever she was attacked by Republicans, produced a very different result this time. The campaign sent 3 appeals in the week after the hearing, each built around the familiar language of persecution and resistance. The first raised a respectable $200,000, but that was 40% below the average for an appeal after a controversy. The second raised $80,000. The third raised only $31,000. And this downward trend told a story that no press release could ever rewrite. Her base was still there, but it was shrinking. And the part that was shrinking was the part that writes the checks. Kennedy returned to Louisiana the following weekend. He did what he always did on weekends when the Senate wasn't in session. He ate crawfish. He talked to his constituents. And he said things to local reporters that sounded simple, but weren't. A television reporter from Baton Rouge caught up with him at a charity event and asked about the hearing. "Senator, looking back, is there anything you would have done differently?" Kennedy thought about it. He actually thought about it, which was unusual for a man who normally had a witty remark locked and loaded for any occasion. "No," he said finally. "I asked her some questions. She gave some answers. I'll let the American people decide which ones were true. Do you think she'll face consequences?" Kennedy picked up a crawfish, studied it for a moment as if it held the answer, then cracked it open with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing this since childhood. "In my experience," he said, "the truth is like a crawfish. You can keep it in the pot for a while, but eventually somebody's going to crack it open. And once it's open, you can't put it back." He ate the crawfish. He wiped his hands on a napkin. He moved on to the next one. Ilhan Omar returned to the Capitol on Monday. Her calendar was full. Her voicemail was even fuller. The corridors of the Rayburn House office building, which had once been a place where colleagues stopped to chat and staffers lingered to be noticed, were now just corridors, with people walking by with phones in their hands and their eyes looking straight ahead. The universal body language of a building that had decided, without a discussion, to create distance. Her office released a statement about a housing bill. It received no coverage. She posted about health care funding. The engagement was half its usual level. She requested a meeting with the Democratic caucus leadership to discuss the coordinated attacks on progressive members. The meeting was scheduled, then rescheduled again, which, in the language of congressional scheduling, it means the same thing as the word never, but just takes longer to say. And somewhere in Bloomington, Minnesota, a third-grade teacher named Linda Kowalski, who may or may not have actually written those exact words, but whose $27 donation most certainly existed, along with thousands of other $27 donations from thousands of other people who believed they were funding something that mattered. Checked her bank statement, read the news on her phone during her lunch break, and thought for the first time about where, exactly, her money had gone. She did not donate again. The hearing in room 226 had lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes. What it had opened would take years to close, if it ever closed at all. And in Baton Rouge, the gentleman from Louisiana cracked open another crawfish, wiped his hands, and reached for his coffee. He did not check social media. He did not review the news clip counts. He didn't need to. He had asked his questions, and the answers, or the absence of them, would do the rest. That is how it works in the United States Senate. You don't need to land the final blow. You just need to ask the right question, and then sit back and let the silence do the talking. John Kennedy had been doing that for a long time. He was very, very good at it. And Ilhan Omar, sitting in her office on a quiet Monday morning with a phone that wouldn't stop ringing and a corridor that wouldn't stop emptying, I was only beginning to understand just how good